was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
So as officials from the United States and Russia meet to discuss increasing tensions between the U.S. and Iran, a new report claims that Pentagon officials are planning to send 120,000 troops to the Middle East. But President Trump is saying that's fake news. RT's Rachel Blevins has the details.
Officials within the Trump administration are being accused of preparing for a potential war with Iran, as a new report claims that the latest military plan could send around 120,000 American troops to the Middle East. These troops would be potentially deployed if Iran was accused of attacking American forces in the region, or if it accelerates work on nuclear weapons. The acting defense secretary did not include a full land invasion of Iran in the reported plan, which was unveiled during a meeting with the director of the CIA, the director of national intelligence, and national security advisor John Bolton. The plan for a dramatic increase in land, air, and naval forces was reportedly ordered by Bolton himself, with the report noting that he previously pushed for similar aggression against Iran while working for the administration of George W. Bush. While President Trump has appeared to be receptive of Bolton's views on foreign policy in a number of areas, he referred to this report as fake news. He told reporters, quote, "We have not planned for that. Hopefully we're not going to have to plan for that. And if we did that, we'd send a hell of a lot more troops than that." However, Trump did issue a stern warning to Iran on Monday, claiming that if they decided to attack American forces in the Middle East, they would regret it.
We'll see what happens with Iran. If they do anything, it will be a very bad mistake. If they do anything, I'm hearing little stories about Iran. If they do anything, they will suffer greatly. We'll see what happens with Iran.
Former Pentagon official Michael Maloof said earlier he believes there is a clear disconnect between Trump and his officials regarding their approach to Iran.
I think it's a Bolton-Pompeo thing. I don't think Trump wants necessarily having a conflict leading up to the elections. I mean, and there has been some talk behind the scenes that Trump has actually had to rein in Bolton a little bit.
This comes after Saudi Arabia reported that 2 of its oil tankers were sabotaged off the coast of the United Arab Emirates on Sunday. The kingdom then claimed that armed drones struck 2 of its oil pumping stations on Tuesday, alleging that Iran was involved. But Iran has denied any involvement in the attacks, and the country's foreign minister said that they anticipated there would be sabotage in the region by what he called hardliners in the U.S. administration for the purpose of escalating tensions. Regarding the possibility of the U.S. pursuing military action against Iran, Professor Mohammad Marandi argued that it could lead to devastating consequences on a global scale.
If there is war, all the oil and gas facilities in the Persian Gulf will be destroyed, the tankers will be destroyed. The same is true in the Gulf of Oman. The Strait of Hormuz would be a sideshow, and that would lead to a global economic catastrophe.
Now it remains to be seen what the next move will be as tensions between the U.S. and Iran continue to increase. But one thing is clear. Reports that key members of the Trump administration are preparing for yet another war, and Trump's claims that they are fake news could be signaling yet another break between the president and his most hawkish official.
Michael, who would benefit from a war by the U.S. on Iran?
Israel. That's an easy question to answer. Israel, and only Israel. Let's again look at the big picture here. It was the neocons that stampeded the United States into the war in Iraq. Everybody knows that. They've all disappeared. We pretended we don't know about that anymore. But what was the result of that? They created Iran as the regional power in the Middle East. Now, someone should sit down and think. That was not your intention, guys, but that was the result. So maybe when you act this way, you bring about the exact opposite of what you intend. So the fact that they invaded Iraq, that was supposed to solve the problem, that made the problem worse. And now the problem is Iran, and now we're supposed to solve that problem, and it gets worse and worse and worse every time they solve it. So we are on the cusp of what could be a huge change. This could be the end game. okay, the end game of the American empire, and maybe that's God's plan. But this is the whole point now. For years now, for decades now, the military guys have been saying, you can't do this, you can't invade Iran, it will not work. And the political guys, the neocons, the Israel lobby, the Likudniks, they have been pressing people to do this, and now there's no resistance anymore. Once you put a guy like John Bolton in charge, there's no resistance, there are no adults in the room anymore. There's no one who can stand up to an ideologue like John Bolton, and the result is this confrontation. Now, where it goes, let's hope it has a peaceful resolution. But there's only one group that's going to benefit from this, and that's Israel. And they may not benefit either, because this may be just cataclysmic. And Israel will suffer, certainly, if there's a cataclysm.
Well, viewers, if you're just joining us, let me bring you up to what we're actually covering. As you see, breaking news at the bottom of your screen, that the UAE foreign minister has announced that there were 4 commercial vessels that were targeted, he says, by sabotage near UAE waters. We actually have the reports of these blasts that took place early morning hours in the UAE, and we have reports of several super tankers that have been hit. Now, the question of the day is exactly what is going on. We're trying to get a better look at that and understand what has exactly happened, who could possibly be behind it, and is it possible that this is a false flag job out of Washington in order to heighten the tensions in this area. Well, E. Michael Jones, I mean, it's interesting. You say that it would only be in the Israelis' interest if actually a war is started against Iran by the United States. It's interesting, like we would not have more dissent coming out of the United States, because, of course, at the end of the day, it would be American soldiers that would be dying, not Israeli soldiers. So tell me about that side of things, about the American perspective, and not seem to be so far very involved in this conversation about a possible war against Iran or not. I'm talking about the average American person.
The last time there was a war protest was the war against Serbia. There were widespread protests here, even in South Bend, and nothing happened. It was completely ignored. In order to have an effective war press, you have to have the press on board, and the press is never going to be on board for any war that benefits Israel because of Jewish control of the media and Jewish control of the Congress. The other issue here, of course, is the complete collapse of the left over this period of time. During the Vietnam War, there was something called the left, there was something called the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. But over this period of time, what has happened is basically the sexualization of the left. In other words, the left, at once upon a time, believed in economic issues, believed in geopolitical issues. All of that has been completely obliterated by Michel Foucault and all of his apostles in the universities who teach his writings, so that basically now America has become one big gay disco, where people are basically mesmerized by sexual liberation and become docile and retreat into their basements and watch pornography all day. This has been a very effective strategy. The sexualization of the American culture has been a very effective strategy in basically destroying any possibility of dissent or protest when it comes to things like war.
Interestingly enough, what the foreign minister is saying is that 4 commercial vessels were targeted by sabotage. So there's already discrepancies, and we know the whole day, as a matter of fact, they denied that any explosions had taken place. Also, interestingly, there were American reports of an American plane and a French plane over the area at the time of the explosion. Is this going to be similar now? Are we looking at another WMD scenario, you think? Or tell me, in general, why would they create it in this way?
Well, this is the jugular vein of the world economy. It has to go through the Straits of Hormuz. I believe 40% of all the oil goes through this. If this were disrupted, that would mean a disruption of the United States economy at a very precarious moment, because the country is way over leveraged, and a lot of what we're talking about are derivatives here. Derivatives are a form of insurance. They're bets about the price of oil going up or down, and if they were to be, people were to call them in, it could collapse the economy. And the one thing that could call them in is a disruption of the oil supply from the Persian Gulf. So I think everybody knows this. The point of a situation like this is not to let yourself be drawn into a situation where you're suddenly eyeball to eyeball because something could go wrong. This is precisely what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a destroyer, an American destroyer, there's a Russian ship, they're approaching each other. Well, the president's in Washington, he's trying to keep control over a captain who's on the high seas who may or may act without his knowledge or permission or whatever. That's why you don't want to lead it into a situation like this, or conversely, the people who do want a conflict, who do want to provoke a conflict, deliberately put people in situations like this.
Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, former Boeing executive for decades, said that deployment was made of the military carrier strike group and bomber task force because credible threat by Iranian regime forces. Axios reporting the threat is based on information passed on from Israel. What is Israel's interest in this?
Well, the Israelis have been pushing for a military confrontation with Iran for quite some time as well, and certainly Bibi Netanyahu has prided himself as being the foremost advocate of a military confrontation with Iran. He just stated a couple of weeks ago outside of the Warsaw Conference that what is bringing the Arab states, and what he's referring to essentially is Saudi Arabia and the UAE, together with Israel, is a common interest for war with Iran. Now, of course, they don't have the capacity of taking on Iran on their own, so the pressure is on the United States to start a war with Iran and essentially fight it for them. And as former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said, the Saudis want to fight the Iranians till the last American. What is also interesting about this Axios report is that it's actually not intelligence that was being given to the United States about what the Iranians are doing, but rather an analysis of what the Iranians may be doing in the region. So we're now in a situation in which John Bolton wants to use an Israeli analysis written by some analyst in Israel about what Iran may do as the smoking gun to start his war. This is not only a repeat of the Iraq scenario, but it's actually a farcical version of the Iraq war scenario.
The world is also becoming a more ominous place as some of the neocons in the Trump administration continue to huff and puff their way through foreign relations. They have now walked away from the nuke deal with the Russians, walked away from the nuke deal with the Iranians, while continually threatening both. Yesterday, we told you about the tense situation between Washington and Moscow, right? The meetings with Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Lavrov. Last week, apparently the United States was trying to oust the government of Venezuela. Today, in our lead story, as you just saw in my discussion with Mr. Gupta, we told you about the tense situation between Washington and Beijing. And now the situation is very much heating up with Tehran. Here's what's really going on there, by the way. So Iran came out today and is now saying that if within 60 days the United States doesn't come up with a new deal, and if it doesn't cease using sanctions and world pressure to destroy the Iranian economy, the Iranians, are saying they will once again begin enriching uranium. So upon hearing this in a televised address from President Hassan Rouhani, the U.S. has now sent an aircraft carrier and bombers to the Middle East to confront, or at least hold off or scare, Tehran from making good on its promise. And of course, Mr. Netanyahu, Israel's Bibi Netanyahu, is now chiming in by threatening Iran while obviously egging on the United States to go after them even harder. So how real, how scary is this scenario that apparently is going on in our world today? Joining us now is Dan Kovalik. He is a legal expert who specializes in global and human rights and labor rights. Did I draw that picture well? And what does it say for our situation here in the United States in terms of some of the people who are running our foreign policy?
I think you do the situation well. I think we have to keep in mind the fact that, first of all, our own intelligence services have said that Iran, if they had any intention ever to develop nuclear weapons, that they gave it up by 2003. The current Ayatollah of Iran issued a fatwa against the creation, development, and maintenance of nuclear weapons as against Islamic law. So the point is, Iran has no intention to develop nuclear weapons. It wants nuclear development strictly for energy purposes. And so I don't think anyone should feel threatened by this. By the way, we have to also keep in mind the fact that Israel has probably 200 nuclear warheads. The U.S. has thousands, and right now Iran has none. So this should not concern any of us.
Well, if Rouhani comes out and says within 60 days we're going to start enriching uranium once again, that sounds like a threat, right? I mean, that sounds, he's saying, look, you guys, if you don't come up with some kind of deal, you walked out on your last deal, you're going around the world telling everybody not to do business with us so you can completely destroy our economy. What do you make of his comments?
Look, I think he's trying to gain some leverage, of course, with the United States. But again, let me make it clear, he's not threatening to develop nuclear weapons. He's just saying they're going to enrich uranium. And he says within the bounds of the nuclear deal that the U.S. backed out of. And that nuclear deal allowed for a certain amount of enrichment for energy purposes. And he's saying they're going to continue to do it within the bounds of that agreement. So I think
Bibi Netanyahu says he has proof that when the Iranians say they just want to enrich uranium, what they really mean is they're going to make a bomb. That's what he said. This is Bibi Netanyahu.
I think Netanyahu can't be trusted on this or any other issue. He's a right-wing zealot who's lied before over such issues. And let's keep in mind, Israel has attacked Iranian targets in Syria, and Iran has not retaliated in kind. Iran does not want a war, much less a nuclear war. They are not a threat to Israel. They are not a threat to the United States. And I think folks need to keep this in mind. Also, people have to remember after,
I'm just thinking as I'm listening to this conversation that you and I are having, even in more, let's broaden it out a little bit for just a minute and be more perhaps general. And I can't help but think, okay, so we're going at it with Venezuela. We're threatening Russia. We walked out of the nuke deal with the Russians. We are now in this mode with Iran. We seem to be going through a very serious trade war with China, which our correspondent Michelle Greenstein is about to tell us more about that. How much can we have on our plate, and is this good, Dan?
This is terrible. You know, former President Jimmy Carter recently said, in light of all this, that the U.S. is the most warlike nation in all of human history. And it's absolutely true. And it's killing not only the people we're fighting with, it's killing this country. You can't spend trillions of dollars on these wars and keep the infrastructure built up and provide health care to people, provide food to people. And that's why we have these problems. It's all going to these wars. It's killing this country economically. It's killing it spiritually. And we cannot go on this way.
Dan, I can't help but think, though, that there's a lot of people in that industry, though, that military industry, that are doing quite well as a result, and that's not good.
The United States is sending the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln into the Persian Gulf, according to a statement that the National Security Advisor John Bolton released on Monday. Bolton's statement says that the purpose of the deployment is in response to a number of the troubling and escalatory indications and warnings Now, neither the White House nor the Pentagon officials clarified what kind of escalatory warnings had been received by the Trump administration. Now, the previous week on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace, Iranian foreign minister, gave an interview in which he accused Bolton of having vested interest in fomenting a war against Iran. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif said the following.
Mr. Bolton has said publicly, before he became National Security Advisor, in a rally that was organized by an Iranian terrorist organization that was on the list of terror groups by the United States State Department, and Mr. Bolton was on the payroll, that he would celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Tehran with that terrorist organization. He's on the record after receiving $50,000 from them to say that. He has said it again as National Security Advisor.
And when Chris Wallace asked Bolton in a later interview about these allegations, here's what Bolton said.
It's completely ridiculous. I think what that interview showed was a carefully prepared propaganda script by the Iranians. This is their effort to try and sow disinformation in the American body politic. The fact is, the president's policy on Iran has been clear well before I arrived in the administration. It is to put maximum pressure on the regime to get it to change its behavior. And I think it's working. And I think that's what they're worried about.
Well, Zarif is right about one thing. In 2017, as he said, you did give a speech to MEK, an opposition group, which at one point, not now, but at one point was listed as a terrorist group, in which you talked about regime change in Iran and celebrating in Tehran with MEK.
Let me just say on the MEK, you know who took the MEK off the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations? Hillary Clinton, that well-known right-wing Republican.
Joining me now to discuss all of this is Larry Wilkerson. He is the former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. Good to have you back, Larry.
Good to hear your voice, Sharmini.
All right, Larry, let's start with the most recent development here about the aircraft USS Abraham Lincoln going to the Persian Gulf. And of course, also tell us about this exchange between the foreign minister and John Bolton about the MEK, starting with what is the MEK?
I think John Bolton and Rudy Giuliani and a host of other Americans have been using the MEK as a cash cow since we very stupidly took them off the terrorism list. The MEK is a cult. It is a terrorist cult. There's no doubt about it. But we seem to have this uncanny knack of calling people terrorists when we don't like them and calling them freedom fighters when they are terrorists, when we like them. And John Bolton has taken money from these people. I heard it was $30,000 a whack and several whacks. But he's in a crowd of people who have done that. The interview was interesting that he did with Chris Wallace and that Zarif did. Both were performing as you would expect diplomats for various states to perform, in this case, John for us and Zarif for Iran. In other words, John's comment that Zarif was a carefully prepared propaganda script was absolute nonsense. If you want to say that, you want to say that as much about John Bolton as you do Zarif. But what it was two diplomats dueling with one another, one of them with a fairly full deck and the other one with the deck missing a few cards, and that's John Bolton. Because Bolton has said so many things in the past, as you've pointed out from time to time, celebrating on the 40th anniversary of the Iran Revolution in Tehran with the MEK, for example. That's what he claimed he would do. Well, John, I'm sorry, that anniversary is past and I haven't seen you in Tehran. So this is two diplomats dealing with each other, and they're dealing with each other on the script I presuppose that Donald Trump has put out there for them. That Trump wants negotiations. He wants to sit down with Rouhani, Zarif, both of them, whatever, and he wants to resume negotiations so he can leap up from the chair and say, look, I got a better deal than President Obama. He wants to do a Kim Jong-un moment with Rouhani and Zarif. He wants to do it really close to the election, too, because it would be a real kick for him electorally. So Bolton is operating, I think, under that script guidance, if you will. But at the same time, John wants more than that. John wants regime change. And so what worries me here, and your talk about the deployment of forces and so forth, and what might be going on with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE and with Israel, really worries me because Trump's attention to detail is almost non-existent. John Bolton, and with regard to Venezuela, for example, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott from Florida, Elliot Abrams, and a host of people are making mischief. Well, John Bolton and his crew are making mischief with regard to Iran, and that crew might include some of these military forces that are deploying there. If we're looking for an incident, it's not going to be hard to manufacture one. If we're looking for a Tonkin Gulf, if we're looking for a smoking gun in a mushroom cloud, you know, those kinds of propagandistic things, those kinds of made-up things that lead to war, then this is a perfect scenario in which to find something like that. And that worries me. If Bolton's operating under this inattention of the president and trying to do what he wants to do, that's of deep concern to me.
All right. Now, John Bolton, in his statement, Larry, indicated that this move of sending the carrier to the Gulf was so that it could protect U.S. interests and U.S. allies. What did he mean by that?
He's looking for something. He's trying to provoke something. He's looking for an incident. That's all I can see in it, because Iran does not threaten a country to whom we are, by Donald Trump's own proud admission, selling $100 billion worth of arms to. Iran does not threaten a country that has more of the United States military power arrayed around it than any other place on the face of the earth. Al-Udeid in Qatar, Khalifa in Saudi Arabia, Military City in Saudi Arabia, Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. How can Iran possibly... Americans need to get off the pot and think for a minute. How can this country threaten anything the United States has in the Strait, in the Gulf, or in the region, when we have so much superiority, and Saudi Arabia and other countries allied with us have so much superiority? Israel has so much superiority. This is all make-believe. It's John Bolton make-believe. It's Mike Pompeo make-believe. And the fact that Donald Trump goes along with it makes him an idiot.
All right. And finally, Larry, the ongoing sanctions against Iran has caused a situation where, people suffering, Iranian people suffering under floods and horrible natural conditions aren't able to receive aid at this point through international organizations like the Red Cross because of the economic sanctions. What do you make of that? And what's the precedent for this kind of behavior? Is there a possibility of lifting sanctions at a time of crises like this?
The precedent, Sharmini, is that this is the most brutal administration in the history of this country. I remember in 2003 when the earthquake hit, bam. You remember that. Thousands of casualties, people buried in the rubble. It was horrible. And I remember going into Secretary Powell, and I just started to say, we need to send aid. We need to send help immediately. And Powell kind of smiled at me, and I said, what are you smiling at? And he said, don't worry about it, Larry. The president's already on it. This was George W. Bush. We were already on it. We sent firemen. We sent search dogs. We sent search teams. We sent ambulances. We sent food. We sent water. We sent all manner of humanitarian support, and we extended it over months in order to help the Iranians recover from that tragic earthquake. This administration is looking at a country, Sharmini, that has received 70% of its annual rainfall in 13 days. Over 1,300 villages and communities have been devastated, flooded. People are in trouble. The government can't possibly. We've been talking about this all along. Bolton talks about this all along. Pompeo talks about it.
And do you think that they can only get worse? Dan, we'll start with you, then we'll go to you, John.
Oh, I think we have to be very concerned about what's happening right now. The U.S. is edging closer and closer to a war with Iran. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, has been very clear he wants a war with Iran. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, very respected official, has said that a war with Iran would be 10 times more costly in lives and treasure than the war in Iraq. Think about that. You're talking about millions of dead, trillions of dollars spent, and yet we seem to be hurtling towards that war without any opposition in the mainstream press. It is quite worrisome.
Going back to World War II, let's learn some of those lessons. Had somebody stood up to Hitler right after World War I in the early 1930s, before Germany was very strong, and dealt with Hitler and Nazism when it was still in the crib, 85 million people wouldn't have died. So sometimes you have to identify these dangers and deal with them when it's easier and safer and less expensive to do so.
Are you comparing Iran to the Nazis?
Well, I think that there are certainly some comparisons. They're both after Jewish people in Israel, for one. For two, they're both, Iran in this case is an exporter of terrorism, is seeking to have weapons of mass destruction, and is outwardly calling for death to America and death to other countries, and is seeking the means to deliver a nuclear firestorm to our shores. So I think that there are certain parallels. I hate to use the Nazi analogy because it,
I get it.
So overused.
Listen, I understand. I was the one who asked you the question, to be fair. It's not like you just brought it up out there. But Dan, I would like you to comment on what he just said.
No, I think the more apt comparison is between the United States and Nazi Germany. Jimmy Carter recently said that the U.S. is the most warlike nation that has ever existed. And it's absolutely true. Iran is no threat to us. Iran is not seeking nuclear weapons. In fact, its Ayatollah issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons. It's Israel that has 200 nuclear warheads. The U.S. has about 6,000 nuclear warheads. Iran has none. Our own intelligence services said if they were ever seeking nuclear war capability, they gave it up in 2003. This is a lie. Iran has never... They will not attack us. They won't attack Israel. Israel has attacked Iranian targets in Syria, and Iran has not retaliated. Iran has not retaliated in kind. Iran is not a threat. After 9/11, Iran helped with the war on terror in Afghanistan, helped fight al-Qaeda. It is the U.S. that has supported al-Qaeda and ISIS in places like Libya and Syria. Iran is not a threat to us.
John, we're down to 30 seconds.
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.